Milton, Counsel for Public Defense and Special Projects, and welcome to NACDL's Engage and Exchange. This week's program is sponsored by Downward Departure Specialists. Downward Departure Specialists assist attorneys in achieving the best possible outcomes in their cases. We at NACDL want to note that the views expressed are those and NACDL does not make any guarantees for the services or products offered by our sponsors, but we do thank her for her support. So we're going to take a couple minutes to tell you more about their services.
Great. Thank you so much, Monica. Again, I'm Anna Stowe. I'm the owner of Downward Departure Specialists, which is a mitigation agency. I also own Anna Stowe Investigations and Proven Private Investigators. We're located here in Northern California. I've been performing criminal defense investigations for over 25 years and mitigation investigations since about 2008. And I'm so happy to be here on this webinar because mental health is such a crisis in our country, but especially in our justice system. And as you all know, most of our mitigation defendants suffer from some sort of mental health illness. Our approach to mitigation is very much a team effort. I've assembled a fantastic team and we work together on each case. So we're a little different in that respect. We spend a ton of time building rapport with our defendant and the defendant's family. We value each defendant as a whole person, and our goal is always to bring their life experiences forward and to make sure that they are completely 100% known to judge and jury. Our main values in working together with our attorney partners are exceptional responsiveness, respect and dignity for absolutely everyone, confidentiality, and we're 100% client focused. We truly believe that our client's success is our success. We want our diligently crafted mitigation memorandums to help you, our attorney clients, build your cases for lesser or alternative sentences for our defendants, but also really to save lives. Again, I'm Anna Stowe. I'm located here in Northern California. I have worked in other states, and please feel free to reach out anytime. You've been seeing my contact information, and I'd love to chat with any of you about any of your cases. All right. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Anna. And so now I'm going to turn it over to NACDL's Corrections Committee Co-Chair, Pat Cresta-Savage, who is going to introduce our speakers today. I want to remind you all, of course, as I always do, that this is a member benefit and engage and exchange series, and that you should consider joining NACDL, as in the new year, we will have a ton more programming. And it's really some of those programs to everyone, and some of them will be, and most of them will be closed. So do consider joining NACDL. So I'm going to turn over to Pat to get us started.
Thank you. Thank you, Monica. And as always, we thank NACDL for their hard work, and both Monica and Shuli for their support in this presentation today. As mentioned, welcome to the Corrections Committee webinar on behavioral health and corrections. My name is Pat Cresta-Savage, and I am the chair of the Corrections Committee. We have a wonderful group of committee members who have done amazing work in advocating for our clients. We try to meet on the third Thursday of every month, if possible, and welcome you to join us. Of course, we also urge, if you have not done so, to join NACDL. The benefits to joining are endless, including being part of projects, webinars, and other presentations that we do around the country. This is the third in a three-part series regarding all things BOP. As you may remember, our first presentation in November regarding BOP basics, we reviewed the How to Navigate the Prison System Guide. The How to Navigate the Prison System Guide is on the NACDL website. Here is the cover page. It is a wealth of information. It provides you links to all the forms and information that you will need, and should be incorporated not only in this presentations, but all the presentations that the Corrections Committee has sponsored. If you go to the site and search, you can connect to the links. And there are several sections that relate to today's topic, including medication-assisted treatment for opioid use disorder, federal medical centers, medical treatment in general, and medical treatment specifically for female populations. Today's presentation on behavioral health and corrections is sponsored by the committee, and two of our committee members, Tatiana Duchak and Jacqueline Hall, will be presenting today. We have a lot to cover, and we will entertain questions. We ask that you put the questions in the chat, and I'll try to monitor them by presenting them to the speakers toward the end of each presentation. We sincerely want to know about the issues that you're facing and welcome your feedback and input regarding these challenging issues. Now, our speakers, the first speaker will be Tatiana Duchak. Tatiana is an attorney and licensed clinical professional counselor. Before attending law school, she worked for over a decade in the forensic mental health field, treating individuals in jails, prison, state psychiatric hospitals, and child welfare facilities. She has worked extensively with survivors of profound trauma, as well as the severely mentally ill. Tatiana graduated from Loyola University of Chicago School of Law and began working as a mitigation specialist, using her clinical expertise to consult on Miller resentencing cases, pretrial sentencing, and post-conviction relief petitions. She also maintains her own private therapy practice and is committed to ensuring mental health services are accessible to those reentering the community after incarceration. Our second speaker, Jacqueline Hall, she merges a decade of federal government relations and political affairs experience with the latest scientific research pertaining to behavioral wellness and addiction. Jacqueline acts as the principal conduit between Wired for Addiction and the entities that they serve. Prior to Jacqueline's transition to the private sector as Wired for Addiction's Chief Operating Officer, she worked as a congressional staffer on Capitol Hill, went on to become the operations director of a Florida-based super PAC, and became a federal government affairs specialist for a large Florida university system, and ended her career as a political appointee to the United States Department of Energy in the Office of Congressional and Intergovernmental Affairs. Additionally, she is now chairman of the board of directors of the Florida Justice Center, member of NACDL's committee, and the Law Enforcement Against Drugs and Violence Florida Program Advocacy Board, the International Society of Substance Use Professionals, and the Pinellas Recovery Roundtable Delegation Committee. Jacqueline ensures that stakeholders in the criminal justice system, government officials, and behavioral health professionals have access to the services and education provided by Wired for Addiction. We are proud and honored to have both of them on the committee and look forward to your presentation. Thank you. Tatiana?
Thank you, Pat. I'm going to kick us off with my slide deck. Let me see if I can. Okay.
We can see the notes, so you want to switch to your presentation view?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Let me start over. You'd think a few years into a pandemic, we would have this by now. And let me see if is that better?
I don't see your presentation, so.
Oh.
I think that's okay.
Okay. Okay. It should say introduction.
Yes, it does.
Awesome. Thank you, Ms. Monica. All right, then I'll get us started with a discussion about the mental health care system and its convergence with the criminal justice system. There's a clear intersection between individuals with mental illness, including substance use, and the criminal justice system. And in many ways, it's the manifestation and presentation of mental illness, addiction, and trauma that can lead to people having interaction with the criminal justice system. As community mental health facilities have closed, correctional facilities have been tasked with caring for the increasing proportions of people struggling with their mental health. And my proposition to you is that these facilities, these correctional facilities, are ill-equipped to do so. Untreated or poorly treated mental health concerns can lead to increased problems while incarcerated and pose a barrier to rehabilitation and successful reentry. My hope here is that with an understanding of the specific challenges inherent in being mentally ill while incarcerated, or the various ways in which incarceration exacerbates existing mental health concerns, we can all advocate on behalf of our clients. Okay, so my question to our group, if you want to drop in the chat, if you feel comfortable doing so, is what topics come to mind when you hear the criminalization of mental illness? I'm sure it's a catchphrase that may have been thrown around. Just so broadly, what are we thinking? And if nothing comes to mind, that's okay, because that's right where the direction I'm heading. The criminalization of mental illness. Oh, I see some coming up. Yeah. I think we're all going to be on the same page. Yeah, we're right on track. People with mental illness are arrested and sent to prison in disproportionate numbers, pretty simply. And often there's a lack of awareness and resources in handling these individuals in the community, which leads to an overly punitive or criminalized response. Oops. Here, just in our general population, nearly 1 in 5 of us throughout the course of a year have a diagnosable mental illness. So next time you walk into a room, a restaurant, a airplane, do some mental math, and there's a significant sizable proportion of our community population that is enduring mental health struggles every day. Approximately 5% of those have serious mental illness, and I am going to distinguish serious here in a bit. And I do that because when we look at incarceration rates of mental illness, there tends to be an emphasis and concentration on what is considered severe or significantly mentally ill, the severe diagnoses, which we can talk about the pros and cons of doing that. The rate of severe mental illness in jails and prisons is estimated anywhere between 16 and 24%. And by contrast, the rate of severe mental illness in the community generally falls between that 4 and 5. So we can already see, even with a limited definition of mental illness, there is already a disproportionate amount of individuals with severe mental illness in jails and prisons, which I'm going to lead to the conclusion that individuals with mental illness are significantly more likely to come into contact with the criminal justice system. So I made the distinction between severe or serious mental illness, which I'll abbreviate as SMI, and perhaps other mental health conditions or disorders that we are commonly familiar with. The definition of SMI is defined by the American Psychological Association Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, and it's pretty accepted that schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder, and major depression with psychotic features are all clumped into this SMI category. I have the rates of this broken down between the prevalence in a community sample versus state, federal, and local jail. Couple things to note kind of as we go along. The research in this area is a bit tricky because of definition issues. Sometimes psychotic disorders are all lumped together. A psychotic disorder could include schizophrenia, schizoaffective, and something like major depression with psychosis. So sometimes it feels like we're trying to compare apples to vastly different apples, but we do our best. So as you can see by these numbers, compared to a community sample, there are disproportionate amounts of individuals with SMI in anywhere from local jail, state prison to federal prison. I have earmarked over on the right hand some other common mental health concerns that don't always get captured in the research or in the definition of serious mental health concerns. But these are common mental health conditions experienced by all of us: substance use, depression, anxiety, grief, and loss. When you lose somebody that's important to you, trauma, developmental disorders like somebody with an intellectual impairment or somebody with something on the spectrum of autism, a personality disorder, and also just general stress, coping, and life changes. These are any reasons, legitimate reasons you or I could seek mental health support in the community. And these are issues that we know occur and likely occur at a greater rate in an incarcerated individual population. But the prevalence of these are not captured in the current research or data. And because of that, they're at risk of not being captured in systems where they're trying to calculate the overall population in need of services, because they're excluded from this definition of severe. And I'm going to reiterate this point a few times, but the goal of correctional mental health, unfortunately, isn't healing, improving, personal growth, to be a better person, a version of yourself than you were, to heal the wounds that you came in with. The goal of correctional mental health is to exist peacefully in general population, which is unfortunate, as we will soon discover, if not already. So this is a heavily clinical slide, but I wanted to share a bit about the symptomatology of these severely mentally ill disorders, so we can have a conversation about what parts of them end up being criminalized. Schizophrenia is what we would categorize as a thought disorder. It's a severe disorder of thought and perception disturbances, often characterized by a lack or loss of touch with reality. If anyone has ever interacted with somebody who has schizophrenia and who's actively psychotic, you will probably soon sense their detachment from reality. Oftentimes, individuals need to have at least one, if not both, of a sensory disturbance, which would be a hallucination, an auditory hallucination. Some individuals experience tactile hallucinations. They feel things are crawling on their skin, under their skin. Voices in their head are probably the most common. And not everyone with schizophrenia has a hallucination. If they're not experiencing hallucinations, they would be experiencing delusions, which would also meet the diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia. Delusions are fixed beliefs, not amenable to change. Common times they're paranoid delusions. There's an inherent distrust or suspicion, and they're not amenable to change, because if you were to reality test that individual in their belief, perhaps that they're being watched by the government, and ask them completely reality-based questions about why they think that, and offer them evidence to the contrary, they would still be really rigid in that belief. So hallucinations, delusions, very common in psychosis and in schizophrenia in particular. The cognitive disorganization is another symptom of schizophrenia, and this often comes across in an individual's speech, but this is kind of their signs and symptoms of internal confusion, whether their thoughts aren't making sense. There's clearly some confusion going on in their head. They're maybe carrying on a conversation with somebody else that you're not aware of. And so there is some internal confusion. Negative symptoms are the absences of experiences that somebody might normally experience in a healthy state. And these might commonly look like depression symptoms. And it might be what somebody notices about somebody else who is experiencing schizophrenia. So poor hygiene, maybe with social withdrawal, isolation, lack of interest in things that they once found enjoyable. And that last point, individuals with schizophrenia often lack the insight or ability to recognize their own symptoms, especially when they're actively psychotic. So schizophrenia is considered a severe mental illness, not to be confused with schizoaffective, which is a combination of a mood disorder and a thought disorder. So schizoaffective is kind of like bipolar blended with schizophrenia, with schizophrenia having kind of like the primary or leading role. So a lot of the symptoms that I just explained, schizophrenia, coupled with also major mood disruption. And that mood disruption could be mania, which is characteristic of bipolar. It could also be depression. Bipolar disorder is a mood disorder considered seriously mentally ill, and it's characterized by extreme changes in mood swings. It affects sleep, energy, activity, judgment, behavior, and the ability to think clearly. Mania is probably what we all sort of commonly think about as associated with bipolar. And when somebody is in a manic state, this is actually when they're most likely to become involved in the justice system, because I think, as we can see, some of these symptoms would increase their propensity for some outside intervention. So when somebody is manic, they're very wired. They're highly energetic, abnormally upbeat, jumpy wired. They have this increased activity or agitation. Usually one of the signs that somebody is going into it, or if not already in a manic state, is that they're not sleeping, and they don't need to sleep in order to feel rested. Maybe they take a nap, sleep for an hour, maybe they go days without sleeping, and they don't feel the fatigue that you or I would feel as a result of that sleep deprivation. There's a lot of grandiosity associated with bipolar, this exaggerated sense of well-being and self-confidence, kind of like thinking you're God or invincible is very common. I said decreased need for sleep, usually rapid, very talkative, rapid speech, racing thoughts, very hard to keep up with. There might be in conversation jumping from topic to topic. As a result, very distractible. And probably not surprisingly, really impulsive. Individuals in a manic stage are often engaging in high-risk behaviors, whether that's going on shopping sprees, having sex with multiple partners, unprotected sex, maybe taking their clothes off at inappropriate times, being nude in public, and engaging in other high-risk behaviors because they're not totally connected with reality-based consequences. So driving really fast, riding a motorcycle without a helmet, going into risky parts of the neighborhood and maybe like causing conflict that they might normally not. All very characteristic of somebody in a manic stage, which can be a symptom of bipolar. Bipolar does have different classifications, and it doesn't always require that somebody is in a full-blown manic stage, but I'm going to kind of dilute it down for our purposes today. And because I imagine many of you might interact with somebody who has a history of mania. Major depression with psychotic features is exactly what it sounds like. It's a depressive episode with the presence of some psychosis. So a presence of either hallucinations or delusions, and it could be some other symptoms of schizophrenia that we just talked about. But depression is probably not all that surprising. The symptoms of which: depressed mood, lack of interest in things that you once found pleasurable. The person who used to love going to the gym is no longer going to the gym. Maybe they're no longer interested in their job or their family. Changes in appetite, changes in sleep, whether either one of which you're over or under, oversleeping, undersleeping, overeating, undereating. You're either really restless or you're super lethargic, slowed behavior, feeling fatigued or at a loss of energy, feelings of worthlessness, decreased ability to think and concentrate also happens in depression. And we often see more presence of thoughts, intentions, or plans or attempts of suicide. One thing I'd like to note is many of these severe mental illnesses are often, when they're often diagnosed, it's in late teens, early adulthood, sometimes a little later. And that tends, if we map that on top of a trend of when people are most often becoming incarcerated or having repeated incarcerations or having repeated contact with the law, people are most likely to be arrested when they're under the age of 26. So perhaps it's not outside the realm of possibility that the onset of severe mental illness also increases the likelihood of incarceration during that period. So my question to you is, thinking about some of these symptoms that I've broken down here, what would be criminalized if you saw somebody, maybe not you, but community at large sees somebody manifesting or exhibiting some of these symptoms? What would be most likely to be met with a punitive or criminalized approach, perhaps whether it's arrest or police contact? It could be criminalized, disciplined in another setting. But what do you think? What symptoms do you think that we're tending to criminalize in our society?
Probably the inappropriate social behavior.
Yeah, that's probably one that we might recognize more readily, and be kind of made uncomfortable by and want some intervention, for sure. I live in Chicago, so if anybody has ever ridden public transit in a city, you might see some of this as well. Hypersexuality. Yeah, I used to work with a client who had her first psychotic break at the beauty shop, where she began talking really fast, talking about the government, and took off all of her clothes and was arrested naked in the middle of the street. And that was her introduction to being bipolar. Fast driving, yeah. Those risk-taking behaviors are often not wrongfully met with police intervention, but somebody weaving in and out of traffic. High-speed chase, yeah. That rapid, pressured speech, for sure. My proposition is that most of these could be criminalized. Somebody who is hallucinating, that can be really frightening for people who have never experienced that or interacted with that. And they might, with good intent, want some intervention. Family members who are concerned when their loved one starts talking about the government chip that has been placed under their skin, might call the police because this person is starting to collect weapons or stockpile food and other things for the apocalypse. Poor basic hygiene, I think, comes up a lot. That's unfortunate that we criminalize, but somebody with poor basic hygiene might be assumed to be mentally ill. Yeah, Baker has gone wrong. I see that. A lot of the excessive energy, high risk, dangerous behaviors, the grandiosity, the things that feel really unusual and that maybe we don't quite know how to respond with in another way might be met with criminalization. So here's just a tribute to the three leading, our nation's top 3 mental health care providers. Cook County Jail is, I almost said my alma mater, but it's not, but close personal relationship over here in Chicago. High proportion of mentally ill. Rikers Island, similarly, at least 20% with those severe mental illnesses that we just went through, and nearly 50% with having some kind of mental health diagnosis. Los Angeles County Jail, 41% have mental health problems. And each individually housing more people with mental illness than any psychiatric institution in the United States. So quite literally, this is where we are keeping our mentally ill population. A brief note kind of on historical context that people may or may not be aware of why that is. Back in the 50s, 50% of all hospital beds in the US were psychiatric. We used to perhaps over-institutionalize people. For many years, psychiatric institutions admitted more people than they discharged. And a significant number or percentage of those discharged were death, because that's where a lot of people were storing the elderly. At one point around 1955, or maybe in the 50s, there were only 26 cities whose population exceeded the aggregate population of their public psychiatric hospitals. And also at this time, like, conditions were not good. It was by no means a perfect system. They were chronically ridden with syphilis and other diseases, deplorable conditions. And so as we exit the 50s, there's increased attention to these issues in books and exposés. Our nation is going into war, leaving war, going into another war. Which is taking away people from the workforce. And the disability rights movement is gaining ground. There's also the introduction of psychotropic medication, and there begins to be this push to care for people in less restrictive settings. We start to get some federal funding for community mental health. When Medicaid passes, they're not covering people who are in mental state psychiatric institutions. Again, renewing a push to get people out of them and service them in the community, impacting as mentally ill individuals are leaving institutions. Nixon is also declaring a war on drugs. There's an increased police presence on our streets, increased attention to crime and punishment. We also have some important legislation passing in the late 70s, tightening the criteria for involuntary commitment or civil commitment. So prior to the 1960s, there were really lax standards about who could be admitted. And probably not surprisingly, many of these commitments were arbitrary, discriminatory, clinically unnecessary. And so that became a target of reform. Those criteria have since been tightened. And it was in 76 that we got the now universal dangerous to self or other standard. We also, I think in the same year, the Supreme Court ruled on Estelle v. Gamble, which established that the deliberate failure of prisons to address medical needs of inmates constituted cruel and unusual punishment, meaning that while community access to mental health was becoming increasingly difficult, there was an obligation on behalf of correctional facilities to provide some level of care. And then we got community funding, federal funding for community mental health. And so those of you who know some of the historical trends, and even the trends for 3 strikes laws later, sentencing reform, we can kind of overlay them onto the prison population with the background knowledge, knowing that at the same time, thousands of people who were once kept in mental health institutions are now reentering the community. I offer you some of these statistics with the thought being that the severe closure of state psychiatric hospitals was indeed harmful for a lot of reasons, but it also cut off access to a level of care that was still needed by many. Not everybody can be cared for in the community. And so hospitals are still necessary. That level of care is still necessary. I think most notably here, now most state hospital beds are being used by forensic patients. In 2010, 33% of public psychiatric beds went to forensic patients. In some states, that's high as 92. And so we're really doing our community members a disservice by not having that level of care available. Not surprisingly, for many, incarceration is the first form of treatment and intervention. It's the first time that individuals with mental health concerns, especially severe mental health concerns, maybe the ones that we talked about that were being criminalized, are actually receiving adequate or access to treatment. There's been a few studies about individuals coming to a psychiatric hospital on their first admission for psychosis, and a significant proportion of them, 57% in some, 12%, 28%, depending on your location, all have at least one incarceration in their background. So these individuals were first incarcerated and then later hopefully receiving a higher level of care, but a significant proportion of them have an incarceration before they have access to the mental health care system. So there's an increase in the mentally ill coming into our community. There's a decrease in funding for community mental health centers. And there's some mandate for correctional facilities to provide some access to mental health care. And so in a lot of ways, an ill-equipped, unfit system, the carceral system, are meeting people for the first time with mental illness. It's the first time they're being seen or evaluated by a mental health professional. It's the first time they're being seen or introduced to the idea of having a mental illness. Maybe it's the first time they're being prescribed psychiatric meds. It's the first time they're receiving what little counseling or therapy or treatment. And it's also the first time that they're exposed to an incredibly harsh and high amount of stressors that do not resemble life in the community. And for many, they've never lived with stability in the community. And so their first introduction to all of that is when they land in the carceral system. The percentage of individuals with mental illness who are incarcerated in the U.S. Is thought to be 5 to 8 times greater than those with mental illness living in free society. So reiterating a point. What does that mean? What impact does it have? Well, it impacts the individuals with mental illness while they're incarcerated. They tend to remain incarcerated longer, in custody longer. There are more individuals in jails and prisons than in state hospitals, as already mentioned. They have higher disciplinary rates, and they're at increased risk of physical and sexual victimization, suicide, and placement in SEG and solitary confinement. And mental illness can impact an individual's chance of parole or reentry. Some numbers to illustrate that. We can see the disproportionate ways in which individuals with mental illness are formally charged with disciplinary violations. And that bottom graph shows for fighting infractions in particular. So if anybody has ever argued for relief and have been met with, well, what does their disciplinary history look like? You can empathize with this challenge of explaining the ways in which an individual with mental illness is not inherently more non-compliant. They're not inherently more violent or resistant to change. It's just that their presentation, a lot of the times, of their mental illness or the exacerbation of which is often met with discipline in our system. This is victimization by another inmate and by staff. Individuals with mental illness are significantly more likely to be physically or sexually assaulted, which I think you can imagine would increase or exacerbate symptoms especially related to trauma. They're also at an increased risk of self-injurious behavior and suicide. Unfortunately, self-harm is often treated with discipline in correctional facilities. I just met with somebody who was in SEG for cutting herself. And she had a disciplinary ticket for, I think, refusing a direct order, and the general like causing chaos or discord on the unit. So she has a long disciplinary history for similar actions. Most often self-harm occurs in lockdown, so when they've already been removed from the general population. And suicide, as we know, is a big problem in our carceral system. And the research behind this is difficult and challenging for like data gathering and measurement reasons, but it's estimated that about 50% of individuals who had committed suicide had a serious mental illness. They're at increased risk of solitary confinement in SEG. When individuals are in crisis, they're often removed from the general population, and they're kept there. And we know that being on lockdown for 23 hours a day, maybe sometimes less. When I worked at Cook County, I think they had 4 hours out when they were in SEG. So, okay, 20 hours. That can also produce an aggravated mental health or aggravate mental health problems. It can have long-lasting effects on physical and mental health. One of the things that I was most stunned to read about the lasting effects of solitary is individuals who've experienced prolonged solitary confinement are 78% more likely to die from suicide within the first year of their release than their non-solitary counterparts. And they're 127% more likely to die from an opioid overdose within the first 2 weeks of their release. And a national survey of wardens indicated unanimous support for supermax type facilities, who also, despite that, acknowledged the decline in mental health, in an individual's mental health, the increase in suicide or self-harm attempts that occur when individuals with severe mental health concerns are segregated or alone, and the fact that they receive little or no appropriate mental health services. There's still a lot of support for solitary SEG and supermax type facilities because of the ways in which they contribute to safety, order, and control in the facility. I'll go through this rather briefly. The long and the short is that mental health and parole decision making, it's mixed research. Some have found that it has a little bit of an impact. Some studies have found that it doesn't necessarily have an impact. So it's understudied and a bit of a mixed bag. I will say that one thing about compassionate release is that the deteriorating physical or mental health, so the times in which an individual's mental health or mental status comes into play, seems rather rare. I'm by no means an expert in compassionate release, but it seems that it's not often a part of the conversation. And that the second note about a cognitive impairment is also used really rarely. And this kind of sums it up. The cycle of discipline and victimization, which is worsened by a reaction to that with solitary confinement and decompensation. They serve longer time. They're prevented from engaging in prison programming. The individuals I've worked with who are incarcerated often lose their programming when they are symptomatic, when they have a disciplinary ticket as a consequence of mental illness. And they're removed from their support or their programming, and it always seemed a bit counterintuitive to me, because that seems to be when some of the best work could happen. Jacqueline's going to go into much more detail about substance use, but the long and the short is that they often co-occur. Mental illness and substance use are often occurring simultaneously. There's a strong link between mental or substance use and trauma and substance use, and there's a high prevalence of individuals with substance use problems who are incarcerated. Trauma is also something that we see a lot of in the carceral system. I detail some background information about the universality of trauma. There was a famous ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experience study, conducted some time ago now, back in the 90s, basically saying that we all have trauma, but some populations are more vulnerable to experiencing trauma, and the experience of trauma impacts your mental and physical health. That's a great TED Talk. I linked it at the end if anyone hasn't seen it. It does a great job talking. Dr. Nadine Burke is a wealth of information when it comes to talking about the effect of trauma on physical health and the effect of trauma on further development. When individuals experience trauma, a lot of the rest of their normal typical development could be interrupted or impacted. And this is just a quick conversation about trauma occurring in a really, really reptilian, a really, really primitive part of the brain. So when an individual has experienced trauma or is experiencing perhaps a trauma reaction, they are operating from a really primitive part of their brain that doesn't keep time very well, that is going based off of really primitive sensory input, and that's designed to keep us alive. So the parts of our brain that are able to distinguish nuance and think about this moment in time and compare it to other experiences that we've been and look at the broader context of the situation, all of those things are offline, and it's a really, really primitive survival response and reaction. Not surprisingly, people who become incarcerated have a higher likelihood to have experienced trauma and abuse even before they get to jail or prison. And individuals who are incarcerated are have some of the highest incidence of diagnosed PTSD compared to other populations that have also experienced a lot of trauma, with female prisoners having the highest percentage. So symptoms of trauma might not be all of that new information to you, but the ways in which they are criminalized, it might be important to distinguish. So looking at some of these common symptoms of trauma, any thoughts on what might be met with a punitive or criminalized response? Yeah, aggression, outbursts. If anyone has ever seen a TV show or movie that showcases a flashback, shout out Grey's Anatomy early season with Christina Yang and her boyfriend at the time, who was a war vet, and the ceiling fan reminded him of a helicopter from his time in combat. Yeah. Oh, I'm glad someone said misinterpretation of social cues. That is a huge one that I think kind of goes underappreciated, is that an individual with a trauma history is more likely to interpret things as a threat because their brain, the alarm bells that have kept them alive in a traumatic situation, are now overactivated. And now when they look out into the world, they are more likely to be really sensitive. Their threshold is much lower for things that they're going to perceive a threat. So somebody getting a little too close to them feels really threatening because of what they've been through. Somebody maybe making an offhanded comment feels like a threat. The way somebody's looking at them feels like a threat. The way somebody's ordering them to do something feels really threatening. Yes, being on guard as a result of trauma. And it makes sense because you've had the experience that this world is profoundly unsafe. Our brain tells us that if we are constantly on guard, that we can perhaps prevent or control something bad from happening again. And we can see where that emotional distress, the paranoia, the hypervigilance, memory problems, feeling hopeless, how difficult that would be in a correctional setting. So knowing that, what are components of incarceration that may lead to re-traumatization? Parts, for those of us who have experienced the prison or jail systems, how might somebody be re-traumatized by being in that system? I have a few guesses, but curious your thoughts. Oh my gosh, yeah. Using the bathroom in front of somebody, or perhaps in front of a group of people, showering, being so vulnerable. Yeah. Oh, I'm glad someone said cell searches. SEG, absolutely. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but a couple of my thoughts. Being constantly surveilled while you are paranoid and hypervigilant could feel really threatening. Being isolated, the noise, just how loud it is, and being already prone to being startled or jumpy or irritable. Cell searches and restraints can feel really invasive. Constant use of discipline, and the list goes on. When I was working in a jail, it was in policy that if you were going into somebody's cell and they were being non-compliant, you could take them down, and you could take them down to the bed, and that was an appropriate course of action. Perhaps, to not just slam them on the floor, maybe. But there was a situation where a bunch of male officers rushed into the cell of a female detainee who was being non-compliant with a search, and they took her down, the weight of 3 or 4 men, against her, being cuffed to the back, against her back, as she was face down on a bed. And I don't think you have to have a sexual assault history in order to have that, to understand how invasive and awful that could feel, and how you might react to that. But she surely had an extensive abuse history, and that just sent her, she was in fight or flight mode, and she was certainly fighting. And that's one of those things that's just incredibly re-traumatizing. So when individuals with untreated or exacerbated mental health issues re-enter the community, it's not surprising that they experience difficulty. They're more likely to experience more trauma. They have stress due to employment, unstable housing, lack of social support. There's also something that's becoming more talked about and studied called post-incarceration syndrome, where even if you don't have a severe mental illness, but because of your experience incarcerated, you come out with a profound distrust of others, and you come out with disruptions to your sensory orientation, you're feeling like you don't belong in social situations, difficulty keeping time, difficulty problem solving or decision making, and a lot of problems maintaining healthy relationships. And maybe that has a profound impact on somebody's life, but it's certainly, the experience of being incarcerated is certainly not helping individuals upon their release lead a better life, given that this is one of the other things that they are prone to go through. We're about to have a great conversation about addiction, so I'll keep my point here short that trauma makes the brain more prone to addictive behaviors. Addiction literally changes our brain circuitry and neurochemistry, and trauma is incredibly painful, and addictions are generally attempts to escape pain. So in a mental health context, in corrections, mental health and corrections, what does it look like? Well, Ruiz v. Estelle established fundamental components of mental health treatment plans for inmates, which remain still in effect today, but they literally provide the bare minimum. While institutions are required to provide screening and evaluations, usually within some temporal frame upon entry, the majority of these questionnaires are 6 to 10 questions. It's a light screening about if you have a mental health diagnosis, are you receiving meds? And you quickly move through the system into classification. So the extent to which screening and evals really help identify treatment needs and are helpful to the individual seem less than the fact that they're used to classify high acuity inmates away from others. Suicide prevention is also a requirement. As we know, individuals who are suicidal are usually kept in SEG or administrative housing. Their clothes are taken away, their property is taken away. So suicide prevention seems like a lot of taking. I would argue that suicide prevention could also mean like having more contact with loved ones or having the ability to have phone calls and visits, programming, something to restore a feeling of hope. Suicide prevention in a correctional standpoint is all about reducing the risk of harm. And I would say maybe not even to the person, but to the institution. It also established that the requirement of trained mental health professionals, but with chronic understaffing issues, there are only enough for the high acuity or severe caseloads. There's a lot of need for crisis management, and most of the treatment occurs in group settings. So unfortunately, the goal of most correctional health systems is to merely stabilize and facilitate the maintenance of the individual in general population, rather than provide hope, healing, restoration, development of coping skills, life skills, really anything that would actually meaningfully treat their mental illness. The physical and social environments run counter to how you or I would use coping skills. I think it's maddening that we tell detainees to practice meditation and deep breathing and exercise. Okay, for what do they do for the other 23 and a half hours a day? Or what do they do when yard is canceled? Or they have to always work out in their cell, or they have the only thing that they have is a pen and paper, and they can't read or write. It seems like that's not helping anybody. A comment on Ruiz, there have been more recent decisions depending on location. Jurisdictions have added to what's required in terms of offering mental health services. I think right now there's an ongoing class action, Brad H. v. the City of New York. There was a class action against Rikers. It started in the early 2000s. It's still ongoing because the city has been repeatedly in failure to comply with the settlement, and it's been extended most recently through 2025. And that class action was to provide discharge services. So to provide medication upon release, case management, and some resource linkage and connection. I'll end with my aspirational hopes and dreams for treatment in this setting is that the mental health treatment in corrections ought to resemble community-based treatment. There can be levels of care, the ability to access services depending on need, and maybe most aspirational, that there's some expectation that individuals would engage in, like all individuals would engage in programming, that this is a time to really improve and better your life. How would you do that in the community? Well, maybe you would maybe you would talk to somebody, maybe you would start therapy, maybe you would meaningfully connect with your family, maybe you would pursue something that you're passionate about, opportunities for self-study or survey courses or correspondence courses. Maybe you would have a job and be able to make money and feel like you're contributing back to your family. You would also be able to meet with a clinician who is not just giving you manualized treatment and groups in an 8-week format that barely scratch the surface of what you need to cover and explore, but clinicians with proper training and in a variety of treatment modalities that best treat all kinds of mental health concerns, ranging from severe to trauma to general coping, grief, life skills. So with that, I've included some sources and some resources for you all in what we will distribute. So I appreciate your time and your patience.
Thank you, Tatiana. I presume that you'll make that available to everyone that's on this
Yes.
list today and other NACDL members. Just so you know, everyone, while we're switching to Jacqueline, Richard Wilstatter on our committee conducted a podcast regarding Rikers Island. And as Tatiana mentioned, it is still under court order, and not much has changed. And so our committee is working on that. In addition, Lori Hallmark, we have discussed in the past advanced directives, which provide the documentation for an individual who goes into the system and can better help in the evaluation of their psychiatric needs. And so with that, I will now turn to Jacqueline. Thank you.
Hey everyone, this is Jacqueline Hall. Tatiana, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I think my portion of today's E&E is really going to talk about some of the mitigation strategies and tools that you as an attorney can employ. We just learned how bad the incarceration system is for those with behavioral health complexities. So we really want to do our best to make sure that our client stays out if that is not where they belong. So as my first slide is loading, I'm really wanting to talk about how behavioral health has been the redheaded stepchild of healthcare since the advent of the field. And we think a lot of that is because there is not enough funding to give the proper resources and necessity to what is required. And so that lack of funding is largely due because it's a low priority item for policymakers. And so that lack of funding creates a situation of limited research. So that limited research goes on to slow technological advancement and innovation, which impacts access to care. So think about how this creates poor outcomes in the general population. What does that now do to the incarcerated population? And so are you guys still seeing this not as a full screen on your end? I'm happy to go through
Yes,
it.
it is not a full screen.
Okay.
You see the slides.
Okay, let's see how we can fix this. Okay, I think that fixed it. Alrighty, so first, addiction is not a moral flaw. It's a complex disease and it's known as a biopsychosocial disease, meaning that there's biological components, psychological components, as well as social components. This is not a single molecule disease like cancer, for instance. This has multiple factors, which means it's going to require multiple solutions. And we're going to dive into what biopsychosocial means in a little bit later. But just like addiction is a complex disease, not a moral flaw, mental health complexities are not weaknesses. It is more common than you think. Kaiser Permanente, who created that ACE study that Tatiana mentioned earlier back in the 90s, came out with a study in 2022, so just last year, citing that 53% of Americans have now been diagnosed with anxiety or depression. Diagnosed. That means that's not accounting for the undiagnosed population or the population that is self-medicating with substances. It's so common now that 1 in 3 children are now diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, all the way up to 1 in 7 college students reporting suicidal ideations. And 80% of individuals, according to NIDA, are relapsing with less than 90 days of sobriety. What we are doing to treat addiction is not working. And COVID has only added fuel to the fire, increasing the prevalence of anxiety and depression by 25%. Now we add fentanyl to the equation, and this problem is out of control. Tatiana did a great job talking about trauma and some of kind of the hallmarks of that word. And it's always important to remember that trauma is more than a way to qualify a negative experience. It has a real and measurable physiological impact in someone's behavioral health along with physical health. And so we're going to talk about ways to be able to identify some of those things like trauma in our physiology and leverage that in our client's defense. We're going to advance. There we go. Okay, so now let's talk about mental health and addiction in the context of criminal justice. So the APA has got some good data. 64% of incarcerated individuals in jails have mental health concerns, 54% in state prison, and 45% in federal prison. The National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence, we can see how much of a role that addiction and substance misuse plays. So alcohol playing a role in 40% of all violent crimes, 80% of offenders abusing drugs or alcohol, 60% of individuals arrested test positive for illegal drugs at the time of arrest. Go through a few more stats, but probably the saddest one, in my opinion, 4 out of 5 children and teen arrestees in the state juvenile justice systems admit to having a substance abuse and or addiction problem. So we've got 4 out of 5 kids raising their hand saying, I think I've got a problem, I think I need help. So out of that 1.9 million, only 69,000 go on to receive treatment. That is a horrific statistic to me, because why do we wonder how they're just funneled through the system from being children, young adults, then to adults that are caught in this cycle and revolving door of the criminal justice system? We need to do more to help them. 80 times. So that number, this was a NHTSA study that said that by the time somebody gets pulled over and charged with a DUI or DWI, they have driven under the influence 80 times. What's important to note is that driving is considered an NACDL, so that's an instrumental activity of daily living. This means that someone is feeling the need to self-medicate with drugs and alcohol to get through an incredibly basic part of their day. It shows that this is a huge problem. So how can we elevate mitigation arguments from circumstances and subjectivity to one of objective biomarkers informing sentencing? We don't want our mitigation defense to really land on someone's life, their upbringing, maybe some of those adverse childhood experiences to explain those aberrant behaviors, right? We want to bring objectivity to this conversation to mitigate the bias that we understand most judges or prosecutors may have. And in order to do this, we have to stop relying on subjectivity being vocabulary and interpretation of those behaviors and establish addiction as that biopsychosocial disease. So definition of disease, a chronic relapsing disorder characterized by compulsive drug seeking, maybe it's alcohol use or really anything that's creating a problem in your life, use despite adverse consequences. So when we look at addiction being that biopsychosocial disease, it can be a really tough sell to say that addiction is a disease when you're focusing just on those psychological pieces and those social pieces. But it meets the very definition of disease when we look at it from that biological lens. So definition of disease being any harmful deviation from the normal structural or functional state of an organism. By definition, addiction is a disease. And it's not a single molecule disease, right? So like feelings and behaviors, those psychological and social pieces can be argued and criticized, but that biological can't. And that's why I want you guys as attorneys and lawyers to be empowered with this use of the biological portion. And so how we do that is through the use of biomarkers. We're going to identify them, isolate them, and measure them. I think it's important to note the difference between biometrics and biomarkers. Right now, we've got a lot of pieces of consumable goods on the market that are biometrics. So those are kind of like those Fitbits that you see, maybe the rings that measure different things. And so biometrics are data points such as heart rate variability, resting heart rate, oxygen saturation, sleep performance, et cetera. And they collect data that's important to sleep, recovery, and stress. What that is reactive by really measuring symptomatic expression, right? Difference is that biomarkers are molecules that indicate normal or abnormal processes taking place in your body, which can indicate a disease state or a developing condition. And so that's going to be proactive by measuring the physiological pieces that are creating the biometrics that wearables capture. And so kind of contextually, biomarkers in behavioral health, I took it back to 1936 when we discovered what we call the chemical synaptic transmission in the peripheral nervous system. So fancy way to say that these chemicals that float in between parts of our nerves, that's when we discovered that space. 1953, we discovered the structure of DNA being the double helix. We moved to 2003 when the human genome was fully completed. In 2008, the 1,000 most important genes to human disease and conditions. 2014, 2015, when a lot of the behavioral health single nucleotide polymorphisms were discovered. I'll talk about what that is. Only in 2017 did a Japanese physician receive the Nobel Prize for discovering autophagy's role in the body. Autophagy essentially is the garbage man of the cell. It's responsible for collecting and getting rid of all of the dead stuff in between our cells. So that's a super new discovery. And then in 2020, the first panel that combines epigenetic and neuroscience biomarkers was developed. So I want to show this timeline because it shows how new these advances in behavioral health really are. So that first part, genetic single nucleotide polymorphisms. If we think back to 8th grade science class, we learned two things. The first was that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. And the second is that we learn that our genes are hereditary and they come from our family, right? So previously, science thought that our genes were static, but we now know that we can modify the expression of our genes. And so a genetic single nucleotide polymorphism, also known as a SNP, is an error in genetic coding, which can lead to aberrant behaviors. So aberrant behaviors are things like risk-taking, impulse control, anxiety, depression, and addiction. Science has now elevated us to a point where we can measure if an individual has no clinical abnormality, meaning that they don't have a polymorphism, if one of the copies in that pair of genes has been affected, making it heterozygous result, or both copies in the pair have been affected, making it a homozygous result. And some of these genes are linked to methylation. So that's our body's ability to break down literally everything that comes into it. So from the air we breathe, the liquids that we drink, the food we eat, what we inject in our veins, what we rub on our skin, methylation is what allows our body to break those things down. Like I said, autophagy, that's the thing that's going to collect everything that methylation was able to break down. Detoxification is the body's ability to remove it, inflammation, neuropsych, and others. So we look at some of these genetic SNPs as biomarkers in behavioral health. I'll start with the SLC6A4 gene. We also call that the SERT gene for short. And what the SERT gene is responsible is for clearing the serotonin neurotransmitter from that synaptic space. This is important because if you have a polymorphism in this gene, not only are you predisposed for anxiety and depression, but more importantly, a less effective response to SSRI medications. So this is the hallmark of somebody who has tried a whole slew of SSRIs and nothing is working. They start to kind of own that. Sometimes they're labeled treatment-resistant depression, when in reality, there's a gene in your body that doesn't let your body know what to do with any SSRI. So this is key because you might have a client who they've been improperly medicated for sometimes months, years, decades, and it starts to look like they just can't get it together, when in reality, there's a simple reason for this, and it's one gene, and we know what to do with it, but we have to identify it first. Another type of SNP in behavioral health is the GAD1 gene. It's an enzyme that's responsible for converting glutamic acid to GABA. glutamic acid being the primary stimulant neurotransmitter, GABA being the calming neurotransmitter. And so a deficiency from that polymorphism can be associated with sleep disorders, glass half empty syndrome, dysphoria, and spasticity. When we look at some of the neuroscience biomarkers in behavioral health, we're looking at neurotransmitters and hormones. So neurotransmitters are brain chemicals that are responsible for literally every vital part of our life, from mood regulation to appetite, sleep, focus, pain, libido, drive, you name it, a neurotransmitter is responsible. And it's important because we don't just have these feelings out of nowhere, right? We have a chemical reaction that takes place in our body, and then we interpret that chemical reaction to be a feeling. And so this is important because when we talked about earlier with that DSM-5 is how behavioral health practitioners diagnose typically some of those conditions. And when we think back to earlier in the presentation, we talked about schizophrenia, schizoaffective, bipolar, major depressive disorder with psychotic features. Those were all very similar. As Tatiana stated, it's kind of comparing apples to very different apples. And so nobody's biology is the exact same that's going to elicit the exact same behaviors. And so that's why it's important to figure out these neurotransmitters, what is creating that mood dysregulation, that focus issue, that insomnia, that over response to pain. Everybody has a neurotransmitter reference range, and it's based on their age and their sex assigned at birth. And so what we want to look at is urine because it's bioavailable versus pathological. Bioavailable means that it's had to process through our central nervous system into our peripheral nervous system, into our renal organ system, and creating an output of urine. If we're looking at something that's pathological, blood, for instance, that just shows us what's circulating, but not actually what our body has utilized and broken down. And the speed through which neurotransmitters communicate is kind of like a text message. It is instantaneous. Conversely, when we look at hormones, we're going to be talking about DHEA, which is really the primary hormone through which all of our androgens are created. Androgens are those sex hormones. And then we look at cortisol, which is really the master stress hormone. And again, those have reference ranges based on age and sex assigned at birth. We're looking at saliva, again, because we want to see bioavailable, what the body is actually used and processed versus what is circulating. It's more like the speed of a carrier pigeon. So by the time hormones or our endocrine system is affected, this has been happening for a long time. Some of the neurotransmitter biochemical pathways are listed here. I like to pick on serotonin because it's the one that we're most familiar with. Reason being is we can't go 5 minutes watching our favorite TV show without being inundated with SSRI commercials. So SSRI is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, often prescribed for depression. And so when we think about somebody who has classic symptoms of depression, they might be kind of sluggish throughout their day. They feel exhausted, they're tired, they're kind of not with it, but then they go to lay their head down at night, seemingly being exhausted all day, and they can't fall asleep. So insomnia coupled with that depression. So in order to have enough melatonin, which is a really important part of the sleep cycle, it's one of the hormones largely responsible for our circadian rhythm, you have to have enough acetylserotonin. And in order to have enough acetylserotonin, you have to have enough serotonin. So it just goes to show that there's no way you're going to have enough melatonin to help you sleep if you don't have enough serotonin throughout your day. And so it kind of just shows how these pathways all work together. So neurotransmitters and biomarkers in behavioral health. Picking on serotonin again, we have kind of come to this idea that serotonin is the feel-good chemical, that it makes us happy. Maybe if one is good, two is better. Not the case. So high serotonin, again, because everybody has that reference range based on age and gender, high serotonin is associated with symptoms of increased anxiety, agitation, even to the point of diarrhea. So high serotonin is not good, but neither is low serotonin. That contributes to mood concerns, including anxiety, OCD, depression, anger, and sense of discontentment, also associated with that poor sleep quality, appetite changes, chronic fatigue, rheumatoid arthritis, overall lassitude. And so we're going to look into a case study here. 49-year-old Caucasian male in Texas. He was on his third DUI. And if you know anything about Texas law, they are pretty much a one strike and you're out state, but now he was on his third. His second DUI was actually a felony. I'm not sure all of the circumstances, but he did time for it. And so once he was charged with this third DUI, the judge was guaranteeing jail time, prison time. He said, I don't care if you wait until there's another judge on the stand who's visiting. I don't care what information you bring to me. You're going away for a long time because you, sir, seem to just not get it. And so by the time he came to us, he had been sober for 1 year. He was going to AA meetings, but he felt like he was still white knuckling his sobriety. He still faced those cravings and obsession, and he was also depressed. And so the first thing that we started with is something called a pharmacogenomic test. A pharmacogenomic test looks at drugs that are most compatible with your DNA and are least likely to have a negative interaction with you. So it's not this panel that's going to tell you what drug is going to work for you, but it will tell you what drug is least likely to hurt you. So the way that we read this is we can see on the left side the therapeutic class. So that's the type of pharmaceutical. To the right, we see standard precautions in the green column means that it's least likely to have a negative interaction based on your DNA. Cautionary is that yellow, right, recommended change. I want to draw your attention to how many antidepressants this man has been labeled as standard precautions. So give it a try. Let's see if they work. Well, this makes sense. Why? So when we're looking at his epigenetic profile, these genetic SNPs, the way that you read this chart on the right of the screen, you're going to see that RSID. So that's the scientific classification for the gene. To the right of that is the shorthand for the gene, kind of what we refer to it as, and then the genetic result. So green means that there is no polymorphism present. That kind of yellow-orange color is a heterozygous result, and the red is a homozygous result. So I'm going to start with that SLC6A4 gene that we talked about. Polymorphisms in this gene are associated with not just an increased risk of anxiety and depression, but more importantly, a less effective response to SSRI medications. So you can see here that he's got a homozygous result. This makes sense that the pharmacogenomic test was like, yeah, give me all these SSRIs, give me all these antidepressants. I don't know what to do with them, but I'm not going to hurt you. So his body, no matter what that pharmacogenomic test said, wouldn't know what to do with any of those medications. He's also got a heterozygous result for the catechol-methyltransferase gene, COMT for short. That's associated with the sluggish ability to alter anxiety or depression episodes. Hallmark is somebody that just cannot bounce back or get off of it. If something negative happens, they are stuck in it. He also has a homozygous result for the MAOA gene, so associated with increased aggression, mood disorders, and drug addiction. I should note none of these genes have been discovered by my company, Wired for Addiction. We simply put them all together in the same panel because we said that this is extremely important, that this be looked at comprehensively to provide objectivity to behavioral health. Skipping ahead because I know we're going to be a little bit short on time. Moving into the neuroscience portion for him. The way that we read this panel is on the far left, you see the analyte, which is the type of neurotransmitter, and then you see the result right next to that. So remember earlier when I said that there is a reference range, kind of a sweet spot for everybody based on their age and their gender? So for a 49-year-old male, his serotonin should be between 50 and 98. He is high at 146 units. So that's associated with increased anxiety, aggression, as well as IBS-like symptoms. And his dopamine is low. So once again, associated with that anxiety, depression, difficulty concentrating, decreased libido and obesity, increased addiction, and other stimulation-seeking activities. He's also got upper range epinephrine, stress response and contributory to anxiety, agitation, irritability, insomnia, hypertension. Lastly, low PEA, depression, ADHD, Parkinson's disease, bipolar. This is so important to note that I use the words depression and anxiety repeatedly throughout that. So more than likely, this, if it was going to be diagnosed and prescribed based on vocabulary, he'd be slapped with depression and an SSRI. Even if he didn't have that cert gene that makes his body unable to respond correctly with SSRIs, his serotonin wasn't the only problem. And thank God he doesn't know what to do with an SSRI because it was too high to begin with. So think about this profile of somebody who already has too much anxiety, too much agitation, and making it worse. Now think about that in the justice setting. You are setting somebody up for failure if you are just allowing them to be diagnosed based on vocabulary and subjective interpretation of aberrant behaviors. So without objective lab work to triage behavioral wellness complexities such as addiction, individuals are relegated to MAT. So as Pat referenced, that's the medication-assisted treatment located in the How to Navigate the Prison System Guide. And MAT, more than likely for somebody with alcohol use disorder, you're looking at Vivitrol or Antabuse, along with other empirically prescribed pharmaceuticals. And so it's important to note that MAT occupies a receptor site without addressing all the other biochemical pathways that I just spent time talking about. This is why not everybody reacts to Vivitrol the way that we expect them to, is because not everybody has the same physiological problem that's driving the aberrant behavior. And so the panel utilized in this case study allowed for the creation of a treatment-centric rather than a punishment-centric approach to sentencing. That is key because when we think about the purpose of incarceration, it's twofold. The first is to punish the person for doing whatever they did that was wrong, and our justice system is doing a bang-up job at that. But the second is to protect the public. How are we truly protecting the public if someone commits a crime and their mental health played a role in that crime, right? Whether it manifested in the way of addiction or your typical primary mental health condition, right? They're sentenced, they serve their time, and they're released, and they go on to recidivate. Why are we shocked that they recidivate if treatment and appropriate services were never included in their sentence? We shouldn't be shocked. And so on the right of the screen, you see this funnel. We've got 3 words that are typically thrown around in behavioral health settings. We've got depressed, anxious, and lack of focus. So based on those vocabulary words, somebody could have been diagnosed with ADHD, depression, or anxiety, depending on the vocabulary of the physician. Then prescribe Ritalin for that focus, Zoloft for that depression, Xanax for that anxiety, etc. Continue that medication-assisted treatment without addressing biochemical pathways, and self-medicate with other means. So maybe now you're not drinking anymore, but now you're into nicotine. Maybe you're not into gambling, but you're into pornography. A whole host of things because you're just addiction swapping. So what was the outcome in this case where that judge guaranteed you're going away for a long time? He ended up, the attorney, getting an attaboy from the judge, and the judge said, keep up the good work to the client. He only did 8 days in county plus probation so long as we were included as part of his recovery plan. This is huge because in our experience, judges actually want information like this because they're feeling that finally they have an objective tool to create a fairer sentence. And it's important because when we think about judges being tough on crime, they really hang their hat on these hard sentences. In reality, our experience has been that they're appreciative for the attorney going the extra mile, but feeling like now I understand why somebody acts the way they do. And finally, there's a solution. So mental health complexities and addiction have many biochemical factors in addition to lifestyle choice. I cannot minimize the importance of free will here because every day we wake up, we have the ability to choose right from wrong. But let's not make it more difficult for our clients to make the right decision and do the right thing because their biology is working against them. And so really hammering mental health and substance use disorders are diagnosed based on vocabulary. It's the individual's vocabulary, be it your client, maybe it's their family, the judge's vocabulary, your vocabulary, opposing counsel's vocabulary, and then they're sentenced and prescribed based on empirical experience. Counseling is super important, and we recommend that everybody go through some sort of therapy or counseling because it can upregulate or downregulate physiology. but it is not enough to optimize these biochemical pathways by themselves. And so often, psychotropic medication is used to neutralize physical threat to self or others and to reduce the personnel required to stabilize the individual. Often, this leads to ineffective, wasteful, and damaging repercussions. So the whole goal of this is to provide objective data to support a condition that's better treated medically rather than penalized legally. And so we started with that pharmacogenomic testing. So if your client is incarcerated, ensure that the medications that they're being given are compatible with their DNA. This is a really low-hanging fruit for attorneys to leverage to their client's benefit, because it creates more documentation to support the need to be properly medicated while your client is being transported, transferred, or while they're being held. And if aberrant behavior is being exhibited in jail, make sure that it's not due to the facility improperly medicating your client and thereby jeopardizing the mental and physical health of the client or those around them. Then include that Wired for Addiction panel. So it provides the objective testing and interpretation to determine the biological factors driving substance misuse and make the case for a treatment-centric rather than punishment-centric approach to sentencing. Proactively recommend inclusion in probation to address this biological piece of substance misuse. And ultimately, that's how we're going to address the revolving door of the justice system. And as I've included a couple references there, this is my information. Feel free to get in touch with anybody at NACDL. They know how to get a hold of me. This is my email address as well as phone number. And I am more than happy to take any questions.
Just so they know, Jacqueline, you are, as panel members, those of you who are on the CJA panel and working for the federal public defender, you are approved by many district courts. Is that correct?
Yep, exactly. So in the state of Florida, we have something called the Justice Administrative Commission, and the state has actually paid for our testing to be included in charges ranging from second-degree murder, attempted arson, down to DUI, so a whole host of cases.
Thank you. And generally, how long does it take to perform the evaluations and provide a report?
Yeah, so from the time that the client collects their samples up until we're able to create that report and go over it with the attorney inside of 3 weeks.
Okay. Have you conducted any training with judges?
I would love to do that, Pat. I mean, as I said, they're hungry for access to this information because it does answer a lot of questions that a lot of people have about behavioral health.
Well, thank you both, Jacqueline and Tatiana. We're proud to have you as on our committee, and we thank you, NACDL, for sponsoring this, and to Anna Stowe. And we appreciate all of you who participated, and we look forward to the new year. In 2024, we're going to be addressing medical health and corrections. So thank you, everyone, and happy holidays. Monica?
Thanks, Pat. So we will provide the slides from this presentation, both slides, and then, of course, our sponsor will send you their information as well. So thank you for attending. We have a ton of programming for the new year, so please look out for our emails promoting those starting January 17th. We have a session on the 31st. So we are really ready for the new year, and so please join NACDL, of course. Some of these programs are open to the public and everyone can join, but I want you all to know that some of these will be behind a paywall and you won't be able to access this type of information for most of our sessions. So please join NACDL. And thank you for our presenters. I learned so much from this presentation. I hope you did too. We'll send these the slides out, the links out, and from our chat. And thank you for attending.